Next, let's go to John Harvey, who is our Chief Information Officer and Chief International Correspondent. John is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I know you just got back from having some visiting your local dentist, so bear with John a little bit today. But we're really happy to have him making a report once again. Another proud son of Africa originally. John was from South Africa, so he will be following up with a technology report, an area of which he has particular expertise. So John, it's over to you.
Thank you, Dean. Appreciate that. And yeah, very interesting topic, the Sudan. I'd love to ask some more questions later on, particularly how Israel, or the normalization of affairs with Israel, has perhaps changed things or had an effect on things. But to technology. So last week at this time, we were talking about Facebook, which had just announced that it was changing the corporate name to Meta. And since then, the internet, of course, has gone crazy. And there have been a couple of interesting developments. Who knew? I didn't certainly know that Meta in Hebrew apparently means dead. I certainly knew that it was a Greek prefix meaning after or beyond, but dead, it reminds me of a car or cars or other products that the names were changed to something that people didn't quite understand. So we'll see how this goes. On the name, Facebook apparently made another error and didn't quite do their due diligence and register the Meta trademark. And again, apparently there's another company out there that has registered Meta in the computer class trademark. So that's kind of interesting. We'll see how that goes. Of course, they've made an offer to Facebook to sell the trademark to them for, I think it was 200 million, which was rather interesting. And then what we're going to do, as I've alluded to, although we've got sidetracked as we've gone along here, is talk a little bit more about the history of telecommunications, because I think that's really important in terms of understanding what this metaverse is. It's really nothing new. It's an extension of communications, an extension of our want to communicate better. And one only has to look back at, say, the invention of the telephone and the pictures that depict the wires that spanned across buildings to the point that one couldn't see the sky. So it just is totally amazing, particularly if one looks at a timeline, how quickly things have happened. So, 1790, let's go through some of these numbers quickly, and I'm going to keep it brief today. But, we had someone called Claude Chappé, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But he and his brothers, and this was during the time of the French Revolution, invented something we call semaphore, which is Greek for sign bearer. And in fact, Chappé called his invention telegraph, and that is distance writing in Greek. And so this really was the first instance of being able to send communications over a wide distance. Prior to that, we had certain things like smoke signals and flashing surfaces to reflect light, but this really brought it to a organized fashion where you had these semaphore towers on mountains that surrounded the area. And the first semaphore was sent on March 2nd, 1791, over a distance of 10 miles. I mean, today 10 miles is trivial, but that's really where we see the start of the official telecommunications effort. where it starts going. And the semaphore is a little bit more technical than perhaps people understand it to be. Probably people are thinking of flags that are held up and used as signal devices. But the brothers developed a device where it looked like a clock and had hands that could be moved to different areas of the clock face, indicating a different message. So as I said, today, we're going to keep things short, and I'll be back next week, probably sharing more about the metaverse, and we'll also delve a little bit more into the history of telecommunications, because that's so important in terms of being able to understand where people come from and to democratize the world. Thank you. John Harvey from Pittsburgh, signing out. Cheers.
Thank you, John. Another in-depth technology report brought to you by Democracy Watch News on our Democracycast podcast series. Now we're going to take a shift and move on over to Seattle, Washington, where the $15 an hour movement really got its start, where so many reform movements have started. Seattle has been recapturing their progressive tradition of good governance and transparency and decentralization, as has the state of Oregon. And Seattle is rapidly regaining their progressive identity, much as it had firmly 100 years ago. So Mark, tell us about the election they just had, the local elections in Seattle, Washington, and give us all an update. I'm sure people have been paying attention to Seattle generally. And usually Mark is also including in some of his reports, not this week probably, but happenings about the arts scene in Seattle, because Mark is also an accomplished physician, a true Bardic journalist. So Mark, it's over to you.
Yes, in a local election that drew some national attention, with former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders making endorsements, self-described progressive candidates faced off with more conservative business interests in a series of elections for local offices throughout the city and in Martin Luther King County. All ballots have been dropped off or mailed as of November 3rd, but the elections will not be certified until later this month. The close voting results for elections to the offices of Port Commissioner and Martin Luther King Jr. County Commission were still too close to call as of election night, but Seattle became known recently for its innovative publicly funded city elections, which are also nonpartisan, through a system utilizing what are called democracy vouchers, where all registered voters in the city were given the chance to spend $100 in smaller increments to the candidates of their choice. But as we've seen in national campaigns for office in the United States, a lot of the money that poured into these elections came from outside sources and from outside the city and from local wealthy business interests. Seattle hosts the headquarters for some of the largest multinational corporations on the planet, including Microsoft, Starbucks, Expedia, etc. And in the past city council elections, Amazon has attempted to influence the vote for city council by flooding the campaign with money, but with only minimal success at this point. But this year, the campaigns for mayor through the primaries and into the general election have been referred to as representing a quote stark unquote difference between the candidates. And in this case, in the general election, Lorena Gonzalez, whose family came to the U.S. as migrant farm workers, and Bruce Harrell, the child of an African-American father and a Japanese mother who was interred with her family by the U.S. government during World War II. They both represent a different source of funding for their campaigns. Harrell is supported by corporate business interests, while Lorena Gonzalez, who's the current president of the Seattle City Councils, says that she represents working families and the poor. It looks like the centrist and business-backed candidates have done pretty well in at least three of the major races going into the days after the election. In the race for Seattle mayor, former city council president Bruce Harrell, he was also a council president, was at 65% of the vote over Lorena Gonzalez. So that represented At this point, it represents sort of a win for the centrist and business-oriented candidates in the city. This follows a year-long series of demonstrations where the Seattle Police Department was accused of using copious amounts, unheard of amounts, unprecedented amounts of tear gas, chemical weapons, and so-called less lethal weapons on demonstrators throughout the year last year. And calls for police reform by representatives and members of the Black Lives Matter movement and other folks who have been protesting in the city, had called for a 50% reduction in the budget for the Seattle Police Department. Under the city council administration headed up by Lorena Gonzalez as president, the Seattle City Council was able to cut funding by about 18%. There were other demands, of course, including the resignation of Mayor Jenny Durkin, who instead of resigning decided to just not run for office again. Let's just say there were some raw nerves and feelings in Seattle when it comes to issues like police reform. The Seattle Police Department was under a Department of Justice review by the U.S. government for racial profiling and excessive use of force. They are now working under a consent decree, which the city is following after the Department of Justice review. So Bruce Harrell definitely does not represent the kind of mayor who will call for the abolition of the police department. He definitely seems to be the kind of centrist, business-oriented person who will probably ask for an increased police budget. Lorena Gonzalez, on the other hand, and her supporters had called for more budget cuts to the Seattle Police Department. In another race that's brought a lot of controversy into the city, Ann Davison looks like she is winning in the election for city attorney. Ann Davison is a former Democrat who switched to the Republican Party during the Trump administration. And her opponent, Nicole Thomas Kennedy, is a public defender who was accused by her opponents of being a, quote, extremist leftist radical, unquote. And that kind of red baiting rhetoric in this election has been a major concern for political observers like myself who have been covering these races. It does smacks a little bit of the McCarthyism of the 1950s. Nicole Thomas Kennedy was very upset at the Seattle Police Department and did tweet out some very, very angry statements about police after witnessing what she considered to be police brutality perpetrated against Black Lives Matter protesters and marchers on Capitol Hill and other parts of the city. But it looks like the Republican candidate has actually won an office in Seattle. Now, it's not the mayor's office, it's not a member of the city council, so Ann Davison will not be influencing city policy directly, but she does have the opportunity to prosecute crimes that are in cases that are referred to her and people accused of crimes, including misdemeanors, which our current city council or city attorney, Pete Holmes, had been sort of against. He had dropped a lot of misdemeanor charges. He dropped most, I think all or most of the cannabis charges for people who had possessed cannabis before legalization. He was at one point at least a very much a reformist city council or city attorney who wanted alternative forms of sentencing rather than putting especially young people and people of color in jail. In another high profile race for the city council, a brewery owner and former city council aide, Sarah Nelson, looks like she is leading by 60% in her election against Nikita Oliver, a nonprofit leader, poet, and educator, and anti-racism activist. A lot of progressive and left-leaning folks in the city had put high hopes on Nikita. She's well respected by the Black Lives Matter movement and other folks in the city. However, it looks like the more business-oriented, once again, candidate looks like she may win in that race. These are not final results. The results will not be officially certified until later this month. But in other elections, King County Executive Dow Constantine is seeking a fourth term, and he looks like he's leading by 57% of the vote against his challenger, State Senator Joe Duang. Nguyen was also another reformist candidate who was calling for, let's challenge the status quo and no business as usual sort of agenda. But it looks like Dow Constantine, who has been criticized by some local progressives, but has also had a very good record on environmental and other issues. He seems to be well in the lead. One of the criticisms against him was that this is his 4th term and it looked like it was time for a change, but the voters decided no. That's in Martin Luther King Jr. County, where Seattle is located. There was also the port commissioners races, which are actually getting some national attention since Bernie Sanders stepped in and endorsed 2 of the candidates. A couple of those races are still too close to call as of this report. But although the port commissioners, don't get a lot of press in Seattle, they do control billions of dollars of trade that go through the port, and there are many environmental concerns having to do with trade and shipping, also labor issues having to do with the workers at the port, the longshoremen and teamsters especially. So there are all sorts of issues that they can be effective on in the city. So we'll be looking forward to the results of those races. Washington state voters actually rejected a state advisory measure for a 7% capital gains tax above $250,000, which was an attempt to try to begin to redress a very regressive tax system in the state of Washington, where there is no state income tax. So multi-billionaires like Bill Gates, our former our late Paul Allen, Jeff Bezos, and others can live here and escape any kind of income tax, even though they're making multi-billions of dollars. Meanwhile, the city's funding for education is below par, and the state legislature has actually been cited with being in contempt of court by the Washington State Supreme Court for not adequately funding public education K through 12 in the state, and other social programs and infrastructure issues have not been addressed because of this lack of funding due with no state income tax. So that is one issue that you will definitely see, as we say in journalism, it's a story with legs that you will see coming up again and again in Washington State until finally a Democrat, probably since they tend to be in the majority in the state legislature and in the governor's office, will finally step forward and say, yes, we need a state income tax. Actually, one of the richest people in the world, Bill Gates, has spoken out in favor of an income tax. And I think they well know, the billionaires that live in Washington State, that it is an incredible tax haven for them and their businesses. By the way, the Washington vote on rejecting the 7% capital gains tax was only an advisory measure. It was non-binding and really doesn't change any existing laws, but it was just a way of voters to express their opinion on that matter. So this is Mark Taylor-Canfield in Seattle, reporting on the Seattle and Martin Luther King Jr. County elections, where it looks like progressives and centrist business candidates have faced off yet again in the Emerald City.
Thank you, Mark. That was Mark Taylor-Canfield, who also serves as our editor for Press Freedom, and as well as our maintaining a special relationship for us with the art scene in Seattle, a major hub in the Pacific Northwest at the very least. That's all for this episode of Democracycast, which is available on TuneIn Radio and Stitcher, as well as through many of your favorite podcast providers. This is Dean Edwards, International Coordinating Editor for Democracy Watch News, signing off and inviting you to join us again next week. Bye for now. Okay, right. Well, let's see roughly how long did we have there. Let me see whether I can get a count on this. We can open up the mics.
Thank you, everybody. Those were great reports, especially the reports on Africa. I appreciate that very much.
So let's
Yeah,
see, we
I'd
were,
definitely be, interested to hear more about, how the normalization of affairs or relations with Israel have changed things or haven't changed things or anything to do with that.
Well, I personally, I know this is something, it's a topic that I think may be of interest outside of Sudan, but I have to say, as a Sudanese, I'm not interested in it. I don't think a lot of Sudanese are. I
So
think we're in,
it
yeah,
hasn't made any difference then. That's what you're saying.
it's not at this moment. I don't see it as consequential. Obviously, this is not something that most Sudanese are interested in. They're not interested in. It's not something that most people have in their everyday to day concerns. Their concerns right now are about matters of the state, matters of existentialism, matters of government. I think if anything, then this question really fits into a picture of external interference. And if we're talking about external interference, then logically what we have to talk about is the first order of external interference in Sudanese affairs. The first order of external interference in Sudanese affairs at this moment is not Israel. It's Egypt.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah, it's Egypt and the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates. They are the primary backers of this push. I know Dr. Hassan earlier said that he took exception with the description that this coup was called a coup attempt and not a coup. I have to go on the other direction. I think it's very prudent for the media and for the narrative to be that it is called a coup attempt. It's only a coup when you accept the outcome of a coup, when you fully accept the new sovereign as the power, as the having power over the state. That's not what I'm seeing. Objectively speaking, it's not just a matter of, my wishes. What I'm seeing is a rejection of this coup attempt. What I'm seeing right now is that we have a situation where we have an illegal detention of government officials who have been given a mandate to govern after the 2018 revolution. When you hear 2018 revolution, please understand that the revolution began in December 2018 and extended into the mid 2019. So it's a multi-month process that it straddles years. In any case, that culminated in a new government, in new transitional government, and that transitional government is was formed organically in different layers. And I have to apologize. I do have some, if you hear anything in the background, I unfortunately have some activity going on and I couldn't avoid it. I tried to get away from it, but so just let me know if you want me to repeat any point. But what I wanted to say is basically the protests that led to with the popular uprising that led to Omar al-Bashir, the former sitting president, who, by the way, I have to say, the former president who was deposed was himself a product of a coup. He caused a coup in 1989. So he was an illegitimate government. And I come back to this. This is why I took exception with Dr. Hassan's characterization. It is illegal to do a coup. So we are in an illegal state of affairs. As long as people understand that, as long as people comprehend that, we are in a good situation. But once people start accepting that this is a legitimate coup, then we're back to ground zero, and then we're legitimizing an illegal government, an illegal state. So let me just get back to the point before I go up too far off on a tangent. The protests were led by an association known as the Sudanese Professionals Association. It's an association in Sudan that is composed of different professions. And they started to organize the mass protests because the mass protests were leaderless. Now, typically you would expect in mass protests, you would expect some leadership, some parties, political parties to emerge and help to take control over the protests. But no, this was not the case. There was no one leader, no one party that was capable of harnessing the discontent, the popular discontent. So it fell on the SPA, and the SPA then was able to lead, and the popular protests were able to force the army's hand to take Omar al-Bashir out of power. Now that was in and of itself a coup, and it was rejected actually. But once the coup was done, it was rejected by what became known as the Forces for Freedom of Change. The SPA formed into a bigger organization called the FFC, and it's not so much that it's an organized organization. It's really a loose coalition of different factions, different parties, political parties in Sudan. But in any case, it was functional enough to be able to speak on behalf of the people. Now, I want to remind everybody, we are talking about an unelected body here. So it's very difficult for any body to assert that it has a popular mandate to carry forth with the people's demands. So we're talking about here a moment of creation, right? It's not a democracy yet, and so we have to make exceptions. We have to make allowances, and power structures evolve naturally in these conditions where people accept this group of people represents us. And that was the case. The FFC spoke for the people. Now, what happened is you had certain people within the FFC who did not accept the military as the sovereign. And the military saw itself as a sovereign, and it tried to make that point to the civilians of leading the protests. And the civilians said, no, you're not. How can you say that? You're not even an elected government. He wasn't elected. He wasn't elected into power. How can you say you're elected into power? Initially, the FFC, I think, this is my understanding from my discussions with my readings. Initially, the FFC tried to form its own government amongst the different parties. But I think that it became apparent that given the infighting, even amongst people who are what I would call civilian Democrats in some way, shape, or form, realized that that cannot materialize. The second thing I heard was a very interesting argument from a person called Kamal Yusuf Mohammed, or Khalid Yusuf Mohammed. I apologize, it was a little, Khalid Yusuf Mohammed said basically that, he posed this question to a bunch of angry Sudanese who were really fiercely upset with him and the other members of the FFC for forming an agreement with the military. And he said to them, and I agree with him, he said to them, do you guys understand that we have 5 major armies in this land? Do you understand that? How do you suppose we're supposed to just form a government and fulfill your mandate, which is peace, justice, and freedom? How do you suppose we're supposed to do that? We can't do that. We have 5 armed groups. We have 5 armed groups fighting each other. We have to try to form some sort of coalition that serves all our interests in the end, and try to discuss this, try to reason this out. Now, I'm just making the argument that he gave to a bunch of really angry protesters. There are a lot of people who would disagree with that till this day. I am not one of them. I'm a pragmatist. I understand. I've read enough of Sudan. I understand enough of its history, and I see as an outsider, insider. I'm not totally an insider Sudanese, but when I look at it from the outsider, I see a divided country. It's a divided people. There are many ethnic groups. It's a vast country. It's a country whose people, frankly, don't even understand how big the country is. I'll be very honest with you. And maybe some people might take exception to that, but I'm speaking as somebody who listens to people, listens to them talk about Sudan, and we don't have a critical mass of people who really understand the enormity of the challenge of governing this country, the size of it. Sudan alone used to be about a quarter the size of the United States with South Sudan a long time ago. It used to be a quarter the size of the United States. You have a country a quarter the size of the United States with all these ethnic groups. It's with artificial boundaries since independence. Of course, they don't know what to do.